James Caldwell awoke to absolute darkness. His body was heavy, his head clouded, as though emerging from the depths of a nightmarish sleep. Panic crept over him as he struggled to make sense of the disorienting silence. He tried moving his hands, but they seemed barely able to shift from his side. His legs were pinned, and the space around him felt oppressively close, like a prison confining him from every angle. With his senses sharpening, he noticed a faint smell of wood and velvet. A wild thought struck him, one that he instantly wanted to deny. But as he took in the limited space and the hard, lined walls pressing against him, reality settled in, cold and unyielding. He was in a coffin. James's pulse pounded as he fought the mounting horror of his realization. His breath quickened, and he forced himself to take in slow, steadying breaths. Panic would do him no good now. He clenched his hands, willing his fingers to respond, straining against the fog that seemed to paralyze him. His mind was racing, trying to recall the last thing he remembered. A vague image surfaced. A party, dim lights, laughter, a glass of champagne. He'd felt a slight dizziness, but he had assumed it was fatigue from the stress of his business dealings. Now he realized, with a sickening certainty, that it had been something far more sinister. Just then, his ears caught a muffled sound, a voice distorted by the thickness of wood and earth. He froze, straining to listen, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. The voice became clearer, and he recognized it immediately. It was Sarah, his wife. James's mind reeled. Was she here to mourn him? But no, something in her tone was too composed, almost casual. Finally, she said, her voice cold and unfeeling. It's all over. It went perfectly, Michael. Michael? The name struck him like a blow. Michael was supposed to be his friend, his confidant in business. Why was Sarah speaking to him at her husband's funeral? Another voice responded, deeper and slightly nervous. Are you sure no one will suspect? Sarah let out a dismissive laugh. Trust me, Michael. He was so predictable, so willing to trust that I cared for him. He never saw it coming. He always thought I was the loving wife, supportive and doting. Now, all that money, all those assets are ours. Each word sank into James like a dagger. He could hardly breathe, a mix of betrayal and rage constricting his chest. She had planned this, they both had. And he had been blind, so consumed by his work and his trust in her that he had ignored the subtle signs, the moments she pulled away or seemed cold. Just the whole poisoning part. Michael's voice sounded hesitant, uneasy. Are you sure it won't leave any trace? Sarah laughed again, the sound devoid of any warmth. I made sure it was slow, subtle. A tiny dose over weeks, Michael. By the time he collapsed, it looked like a heart attack. Who's going to question it? Besides, we've been discreet, haven't we? Michael was silent for a moment. I guess. But his family, what if they get suspicious? Don't be ridiculous, she snapped. They barely knew him anymore, wrapped up in their own lives. No one will look closely enough to notice anything. By tomorrow, he'll be just a memory. James's fury surged, a blinding wave that made his hands clench into fists. He strained against the confinement of the coffin, pushing his shoulders up and his arms outward, but the effects of whatever drug she'd used still weighed him down. The lid pressed down mercilessly, and he felt his strength waning, leaving him with nothing but his thoughts. He had to survive this. He would find a way. As James lay trapped in his coffin, paralyzed but painfully alert, he focused all his energy on listening to the conversation happening just inches above him. Every word seared his mind, fueling a rage that pulsed through him like a second heartbeat. Above, Sarah's voice carried a calm satisfaction that chilled him to the core. By this time tomorrow, she continued, her tone as light as if discussing the weather, the lawyers will start transferring everything over. And then, Michael, you and I will have everything we need to start fresh. James clenched his jaw, fighting the helplessness that throbbed through his body. He remembered every moment with her, every night spent planning their future, every promise exchanged. She had woven a careful illusion, perfect enough that he'd never questioned her loyalty. He had trusted her implicitly, but he now saw her kindness for what it was, a mask to disguise her ambition and greed. Are you sure no one will connect the dots? Michael's voice sounded nervous, and James could almost picture him shifting uncomfortably. Oh, Michael, Sarah cooed, her voice dripping with reassurance, I've taken care of every last detail. James was reckless with his health. It was only a matter of time before his heart gave out. You saw how exhausted he was lately. The poisoning was subtle, almost like an art. Small doses over time, so his body would just give in. No one would suspect anything but natural causes. James's stomach churned. The very woman he had shared his life with, who had stood by him during both his successes and failures, had coldly plotted his demise with a meticulousness that was terrifying. The realization was nearly paralyzing, but he forced himself to concentrate. She wouldn't get away with this, not if he could escape, not if he could somehow find a way to expose her. Michael's tone shifted, a bit uncertain. So, what happens to his family? Sarah's laughter was bitter. James barely spoke to them. His sister lives halfway across the country, and his niece has always been more interested in spending his money than in family dinners. No one will investigate his death. They'll grieve for a few days, take their inheritance, and move on. Trust me, Michael, we're in the clear. The ease with which she dismissed his family's grief disgusted James. His heart ached as he thought of his sister, Rachel, and his niece, Emily. They may not have been close lately, but they had been there for him when he'd needed them most in his earlier years. He felt an overwhelming urge to reach out to warn them, but that could only happen if he survived. He forced himself to keep listening, hoping to gather as much information as possible. Michael seemed to gather some courage. And when do we go public? I mean, about us? James's fingers twitched, a surge of anger spurring his muscles to life. His suspicions had been correct. Michael wasn't just a business associate, as he had thought, but Sarah's lover. The pieces fell into place, each more painful than the last. Every business dinner, every evening when she had arrived home late, claiming it was traffic, it had all been an elaborate lie. Sarah's voice took on a calculating edge. We need to be careful, Michael. Too soon, and people might talk. They'd question how I could move on so quickly. But a few months from now, we'll be the perfect picture of love blossoming after tragedy. Just keep your patience and soon, we'll have everything we ever wanted. James's mind was spinning. The betrayal was beyond what he could have imagined. He pictured Sarah and Michael parading around with his fortune, playing the grieving widow and loyal friend while basking in the success of their treachery. He clenched his fists, feeling a flicker of strength returning to his body. He couldn't allow them to get away with this. Fine, Michael said, though his tone was uneasy. But there's one thing that's been bothering me. What if he somehow left evidence? You know how meticulous James was with his records. What if he had something hidden? Sarah's laugh was low and mocking. You worry too much, Michael. James trusted me blindly. He shared everything, his passwords, his plans, his finances. There's nothing that would incriminate us because he never even suspected. He thought I was his partner, his better half, she added, her tone dripping with contempt. In truth, he was just a pawn. A foolish man who happened to have what I needed. The words sliced through James like knives. She hadn't just deceived him, she had preyed on him, exploited his trust and affection for her own gain. His chest burned with the urge to confront her, to make her see the fury she had awakened. As if on cue, his body surged with adrenaline, and he felt the strength to curl his fingers into fists. The stiffness in his arms was fading, and he could finally move his legs. Whatever she had given him was wearing off, though the effects lingered. He took a steadying breath, forcing his mind to focus on his goal. He needed to escape this coffin. He needed to stop her. Let's get going, Michael, Sarah said, her tone one of finality. I'm done here. We'll let him rest in peace. James heard their footsteps retreating, the sound growing fainter as they walked away from the grave. His breathing quickened as he struggled to push upward, feeling the unyielding weight of the coffin lid above him. His muscles ached, but he ignored the pain, every ounce of his being fueled by a single purpose: survival. Sarah might think she'd won, but he would prove her wrong. He pushed harder, the lid shifting a fraction of an inch. The realization that he could move it gave him the strength to keep going. He was far from dead, and he would make sure Sarah and Michael learned that in the most unforgettable way possible. The weight of the coffin lid bore down on James Caldwell, but now, with renewed determination, he fought back against the darkness that surrounded him. His muscles burned, weakened from the sedative Sarah had used to stage his death, but he refused to let the exhaustion overtake him. Every inch of movement came at a cost, each breath a labor that left his chest tight and his head spinning. He pressed his palms flat against the wooden lid, feeling the subtle shift when he applied his weight. The realization fueled him, an ember of hope igniting into a desperate blaze. He wouldn't die here, not at the hands of Sarah, not for her and Michael to live a life of luxury funded by his blood. Slowly, he felt his coordination returning. The poison, whatever Sarah had used to render him helpless, was wearing off. His breathing was ragged, his fingers tingling as sensation returned. For a moment, his mind flashed to memories of them, moments that now felt tainted. Sarah, her laughter filling their home, their intimate talks late into the night. The person he had trusted most in the world had turned into the monster that would bury him alive. The quiet in the graveyard pressed down on him, broken only by the sounds of his own labored breaths. Desperation clawed at him, tightening his focus. He pressed his fists against the lid and pushed again, gritting his teeth as he channeled every ounce of strength into that single motion. It was like fighting against the weight of an entire mountain, but inch by inch, he felt the lid loosen. A slight shift, then another. But the exhaustion was unbearable. His breaths were growing shallow, his head pounding from lack of oxygen. His arms trembled, and for a terrifying second, he feared they would give out. How much air did he have left? He couldn't tell. Time was slipping away, his entire world reduced to the narrow confines of his prison. The longer he lay there, the more he feared he'd never make it out. And then an idea struck him. The watch on his wrist. His smartwatch. He'd almost forgotten it in his desperation, but now he lifted his wrist, squinting at the faint glow. The watch had a built-in emergency function, a failsafe of sorts. If his heart rate dropped below a certain level, it would alert emergency services and his security team. His pulse quickened. Was it possible that it had already detected his low vitals? Could help be on its way? Or had Sarah found a way to disable it? He tapped the watch screen, willing it to respond, praying for the familiar sensation of vibration that would indicate an alert had been sent. But there was nothing. The silence gnawed at him, cold and relentless. Either it wasn't functioning, or he was truly alone. A surge of anger burst through him, stronger than before. He wouldn't wait for rescue. He would save himself. Ignoring the pain, the burning in his muscles, he gritted his teeth and heaved his weight against the lid once more. It shifted a fraction, and this time he heard the faintest creak. A small victory, but a victory nonetheless. With renewed determination, he braced himself and pushed again. The wood gave way a little more, and a thin sliver of air seeped in. The scent of fresh earth filled his nostrils, a reminder of the weight that lay above him. He was so close, close enough to feel freedom on the other side of that wooden barrier. A memory floated to him, unbidden, of Sarah encouraging him through his toughest days, back when they were newly married and he was struggling to establish his company. She would sit beside him, her hand on his back, whispering words of encouragement. And he'd believed every word. Now, her betrayal seared him like fire, every whisper of love and support nothing more than manipulation. But he used the anger to fuel him, transforming it into a lifeline. James summoned his last reserves of strength, ignoring the throbbing in his muscles and the dizzying pain in his chest. He pushed with everything he had, feeling the lid shift again. The coffin began to open inch by inch, the fresh night air trickling in. He gulped it down, savoring the relief of cool oxygen on his lungs. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the lid lifted enough for him to drag his upper body out of the coffin. His vision swam, stars dotting his line of sight, but the relief of freedom was almost overwhelming. He collapsed beside the open coffin, his body sprawled on the cold, damp earth. The graveyard was silent. His eyes adjusted to the faint moonlight filtering through the trees, casting long shadows over the gravestones. The air was cool against his skin, grounding him in the reality that he had escaped. He wasn't dead. He was alive, and he was free. He took a moment to breathe deeply, steadying himself as he planned his next move. The adrenaline was fading, and with it, the pain and exhaustion were setting in. But he knew he couldn't rest. He couldn't stop now. He had to confront Sarah and Michael, to show them that their plan had failed, that he was coming for them. James staggered to his feet, wincing as the aches from his struggle settled into his bones. His clothes were rumpled, his body covered in the scent of earth and sweat, but he barely noticed. He was consumed with only one thought. Sarah and Michael had stolen everything from him, his trust, his love, his life. But now, he would take it all back. With a grim determination, he began his slow journey back to the mansion, the place that should have been his sanctuary. Tonight, it would be the setting for his revenge as James staggered through the quiet streets on his way home. His thoughts churned with everything he'd heard. The betrayal was still fresh, raw, and festering. Every word he'd overheard from Sarah and Michael replayed in his mind, each one a needle stabbing at his sanity. He clenched his fists, the pain of his fingernails digging into his palms grounding him. The mansion loomed ahead, its cold silhouette stark against the night sky. Once, it had been a place of warmth and achievement, a monument to the success he'd built from the ground up. Now, it felt like a monument to his own folly, the walls standing as reminders of the blind trust he'd placed in a woman who'd only wanted to see him buried beneath them. Creeping toward the front of the house, he spotted the faint glow of light spilling from the living room windows. Shadows moved inside, Sarah and Michael, enjoying their ill-gotten gains. For a moment, he considered bursting through the door, letting his rage pour out in a torrent of accusations and condemnation. But something held him back. He wanted to know more. He needed to know the full extent of their plan. James slipped around the side of the house, moving with careful steps toward the open window. He crouched beneath it, steadying his breath as he listened. Inside, Michael's voice was low and nervous. "Are you sure everything's in place? I mean, his lawyers will want to see proof, documentation. They're bound to ask questions." Sarah's tone was cold, calculated. "Relax. I've already taken care of all that. I've studied James's business dealings for years, Michael. His lawyers are thorough, but they won't question the signed documents I've prepared. Once I submit those to probate, everything will go smoothly. James trusted me with all his finances. In their eyes, I'm just the poor widow trying to put her life back together." Michael let out a sigh, a hint of tension still lingering in his voice. "But won't his sister want answers? She always seemed close to him." A derisive laugh escaped Sarah. "Rachel barely speaks to him these days. She won't question anything. And even if she did, she lives states away and has no insight into his finances. As far as she's concerned, James died of natural causes. Once the assets are transferred, they'll all think I'm grieving in peace while I liquidate everything." James's stomach turned. Sarah had meticulously thought through every angle, every possible loose end. She had planned this for far longer than he'd imagined, even timing it to seem like a sudden death. He marveled bitterly at how much effort she had put into deceiving him, at how she'd studied him not as a partner or spouse, but as an asset to be conquered. Michael's tone turned skeptical. "And what about the staff? His security team?" "Michael, please." Sarah's voice was laced with impatience. "The security staff has no loyalty to James beyond their paycheck. As far as they know, he died a natural death. I've even prepared severance packages to dismiss most of them quietly, to reduce suspicion. The ones who remain will answer only to me." Michael fell silent, and James could almost feel the tension between them from where he crouched outside. The silence stretched for several seconds before Sarah spoke again, her tone shifting to a softer, almost seductive pitch. "Think about it, Michael," she purred. "By the end of the month, all of this will be ours. Every cent, every inch of this house. We'll finally be free to do what we want. Just you and me, no more hiding, no more secrets." Michael's hesitation seemed to wane as she spoke, and James clenched his fists, forcing himself to remain silent. He couldn't allow himself to burst in now. Not yet. He wanted them to believe they were safe, to let their guard down, so that when he did make his move, it would be all the more devastating. Michael's voice softened, the tension finally easing. "I know. It just feels surreal. He trusted us, and now we have everything he worked for." "Yes," Sarah replied, her voice filled with a twisted satisfaction. "And he was none the wiser. Men like James are so focused on their own success that they don't even see the people right beside them. He never suspected a thing." James felt the weight of her words like a physical blow. She saw him as nothing more than a fool, someone who had been too blinded by his own ambitions to notice her creeping betrayal. But he would show her that he wasn't the naive pawn she thought he was. He would use her arrogance against her. There was a rustling sound, and he peered cautiously around the window frame, careful to stay out of sight. Inside, he could see Sarah moving to the liquor cabinet, pouring 2 glasses of his favorite whiskey. She handed one to Michael with a cold, self-satisfied smile. "To new beginnings," she said, raising her glass. Michael clinked his glass against hers, his eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and greed. "To new beginnings." James watched them drink to his death, toasting to the freedom they thought they had secured. He felt a surge of rage, so powerful it almost broke his resolve. But he held himself back, inhaling deeply to quell the storm inside him. He couldn't let his emotions rule him now. He needed to be calm, calculating, just as she had been. He leaned back against the wall, his mind racing. He would give them their new beginning, but not the one they were celebrating. He would tear apart every piece of this life they thought they had stolen. He would make sure they paid for every moment of betrayal, every ounce of trust they had twisted into a weapon against him. As he crept away from the window, a plan was already beginning to form in his mind. He would expose them, ruin them in the eyes of everyone they had deceived. And when they realized the depth of his wrath, they would know exactly what it felt like to be trapped, helpless, and utterly alone. Tonight was just the beginning. James retreated from the mansion's window, his mind racing with a fierce determination. He felt the weight of Sarah's betrayal bearing down on him, but his anger had transformed into something else, a cold, focused resolve. She thought she had buried him along with her secret, but James was very much alive, and soon she would feel his presence haunting her every move. He slipped into the shadows, seeking refuge behind the garden wall to gather his thoughts. In his years building his fortune, he'd faced formidable opponents in boardrooms and negotiated under intense pressure. But this was different. This time, it was personal. He had been deceived by the very people he trusted most, and the only way forward was through careful, relentless revenge. As he sat against the stone wall, his breathing slowed. The night air was sharp and cool against his skin, grounding him. His fingers brushed the fabric of his jacket, and he remembered his smartwatch, the emergency feature he had relied on to track his vitals. He raised his wrist, staring at the dim glow of the watch face as it finally responded to his touch. A faint vibration confirmed it had detected his dangerously low heart rate earlier, sending a signal for help. He held his breath, hoping that the signal had reached his head of security, Alan Pierce, a man who had worked with him for years. If anyone could be trusted to investigate his death, it was Alan. A quiet man of loyalty and integrity, Alan had always been there for him, no matter the hour or circumstance. With renewed hope, James opened a hidden messaging app on his watch, a feature he'd added specifically for emergencies. Typing quickly, he sent Alan a short but direct message. "Alan, it's James. I'm alive. Do not trust anyone. Be discreet. I need your help immediately." He watched the screen anxiously, praying for a reply. Minutes ticked by, each one slower than the last. Just as he was beginning to worry, his watch vibrated softly, a reply from Alan. "Understood. Where are you?" James exhaled, relief flooding through him. He typed quickly, explaining his situation and instructing Alan to meet him at a secluded spot outside the mansion grounds. He couldn't afford to go back inside just yet. He needed information, resources, and most importantly, he needed allies. Not 20 minutes later, Alan arrived in a discreet black car, his face grave as he approached James. They exchanged no words at first, merely locking eyes in silent understanding. Alan's eyes flickered with shock and a trace of anger, but he held his composure. "Sir," he said quietly, scanning their surroundings to ensure they were alone. "I don't know what's going on, but I've received alerts of strange activity on your accounts. Your wife has been taking over your finances?" James nodded, his jaw tight. "Sarah and Michael, they're in this together. They planned it all, Alan. Poisoned me over time, faked a heart attack, and buried me alive." Alan's face hardened, his lips pressing into a thin line. "I knew something was wrong when I saw the transfer orders. I was just about to dig deeper when I received your message." James placed a hand on Alan's shoulder. "I need your help to expose them, Alan. But we have to be careful. They're smart, and they've covered their tracks well." Alan nodded. "Understood. We'll need to move carefully to ensure we gather enough evidence. But you can count on me, sir." James took a deep breath, feeling his confidence growing. "Good. The first thing we need is proof of the poisoning. Sarah mentioned she used a slow-acting substance, something that would mimic heart disease." Alan's gaze turned calculating. "I'll arrange for some lab work and find any traces left in your system. And if you have any samples of the food or drink you were given over the past few weeks, that could be enough to start." James thought for a moment, mentally cataloging the last few days before his death. He recalled the meals Sarah had prepared, always his favorites, always paired with the whiskey she knew he loved. Had she used that against him too? The thought only intensified his hatred. "There should be some traces left in my personal bar and the dining area," James said, his voice steady. "But I want to be the one to confront her, Alan. When we have the evidence, I want her to see me standing there, knowing she failed." Alan gave a small nod, a hint of admiration in his eyes. "We'll do it your way, sir. But if I may, I'd suggest moving quickly. Sarah may start to move assets into offshore accounts if she suspects any trouble." James's eyes flashed. "Then let's get to work." Over the next several days, James and Alan orchestrated their plan with precision. Alan arranged for a specialist to analyze samples taken from the mansion, and they secured files from Sarah's computer, exposing hidden bank accounts and transfers she had attempted to conceal. With each piece of evidence they uncovered, James's resolve grew stronger. Finally, after a week of collecting evidence, they had enough to confront Sarah and Michael without a shadow of a doubt. Alan had managed to track a series of emails exchanged between Sarah and Michael, outlining the poisoning plan in chilling detail. Sarah had even detailed dosages and methods, a testament to her cold, calculating mind. As they prepared for the confrontation, James reviewed everything once more. He wanted to be absolutely certain there would be no escape for her this time. She had taken everything from him, or at least she thought she had. But now, he would show her the true cost of betrayal. James stood outside his mansion on the night he planned to reveal himself to Sarah and Michael. The chill in the air matched his steely resolve. Every detail had been carefully set in place, every piece of evidence meticulously gathered to ensure that neither Sarah nor Michael would escape the consequences of their actions. Alan waited with him in the shadows, a silent but supportive presence. He handed James a small, discreet recording device, already set to capture every word that would soon be exchanged inside. With one last nod of encouragement, Alan retreated, knowing James wanted to face Sarah and Michael alone. James took a steadying breath and stepped toward the front door, letting himself in quietly. The house was silent, the only sound a faint murmuring of voices coming from the living room. He moved toward the sound, his footsteps controlled and deliberate, his mind sharpened by the betrayal that had brought him to this point. As he entered the living room, he saw them. Sarah and Michael, sitting together on the couch, laughing softly, a bottle of his finest whiskey on the table in front of them. They were lounging as though they hadn't a care in the world, as though they hadn't just buried a man alive. Rage bubbled up within him, but he kept his face impassive, steady. Clearing his throat, he announced his presence. "Enjoying yourselves, I see?" The effect was instantaneous. Sarah's laughter died in her throat, her eyes widening in utter disbelief. The color drained from her face as she stared at him, frozen in place as if she'd just seen a ghost. Michael's reaction was similarly stunned. He sat bolt upright, mouth agape, the glass of whiskey slipping from his fingers and shattering on the floor. "James." Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, shaking with a fear she couldn't hide. You're dead. This isn't possible." "Obviously it is," he replied, his voice cold and steady. He took a step forward, enjoying the way they shrank back, their previous confidence replaced by naked terror. "Disappointed?" Sarah's eyes darted around the room, as though seeking an escape. "No, you don't understand. This can't be real. You had a heart attack. The doctors." James cut her off, his voice low and seething. "You poisoned me, Sarah. Slowly, methodically. You and your lover plotted this for months, possibly years. You stole everything, right down to my life. But you failed." Sarah's face twisted, her shock giving way to a desperate sort of anger. "James, you're confused. I would never." "Enough," he barked, silencing her. "I know everything. The emails, the money transfers, the doses of poison mixed into my food and drink. You were thorough, I'll give you that. But you underestimated me. You thought I'd be gone, forever silenced, and you'd be free to live off my fortune with him." James pointed at Michael, who sat trembling, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "And you," James continued, his gaze piercing, "my so-called friend. You thought you could take my life and my wife. How does it feel, Michael, to know that all your careful planning was for nothing?" Michael stammered, his words barely coherent. "James, listen. I didn't. This was all a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" James let out a bitter laugh. "Is that what you're calling murder and betrayal now?" Sarah's composure shattered completely. She rose from the couch, her face a mixture of fury and desperation. "Fine," she spat, her voice cold and venomous. "Fine, you're right. I did it. I planned it all. You were so wrapped up in yourself, in your success and your empire, that you never saw what was happening right under your nose. I'm not sorry, James. I was tired of being nothing more than your accessory." Her admission was like a slap in the face, but James remained steady. Her arrogance was staggering, even now, with her plan crumbling before her. He took a step closer, watching her flinch back. "You were never an accessory, Sarah. You were my wife. I trusted you with everything." His voice was calm, deadly. "And you used that trust to destroy me?" Sarah glared at him, the last shreds of her pride glinting in her eyes. "Trust? You were never around. You were too busy conquering the world, and I was left in the shadows, a prisoner in a gilded cage. I wanted freedom, and I took it." "Freedom," he echoed, his voice dripping with contempt. "You wanted wealth and power, Sarah. And you wanted it without earning it." Michael, who had been silent, suddenly found his voice. "James, please. I was manipulated. I didn't know it would go this far." "Manipulated?" Sarah's scornful laughter cut him off. "Don't act innocent now, Michael. You knew exactly what we were doing. You wanted the money as much as I did." The two turned on each other, their accusations spilling out, their once shared loyalty crumbling under the weight of their guilt and fear. James watched them, silent and unmoving, letting them tear each other apart. It was almost satisfying to see them unravel, each betrayal revealing the depths of their greed and cowardice. Finally, James spoke, his voice soft but commanding. "You two are pathetic. You can't even face the consequences of your actions without blaming each other. But don't worry, I've already ensured that you won't escape justice." Sarah's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, a flicker of defiance appeared in her gaze. "You can't prove anything," she said, her voice shaking but still defiant. "No one will believe you." James reached into his pocket, pulling out the small recording device Alan had given him. He pressed a button, and the device replayed her confession in her own words, each damning statement filling the silence of the room. The blood drained from her face as she listened, realizing there was no way out. "Oh, they'll believe me, Sarah. They'll believe every word," James said, a quiet satisfaction in his tone. "And I've made sure the police will have everything they need to convict you both." Michael slumped, his face in his hands, muttering incoherently. Sarah's defiance dissolved, her expression becoming one of pure despair as she realized that her carefully constructed plan had failed. "It's over," James said, his voice final. "And when they lock you up, you'll have all the freedom you ever wanted, behind bars." Without another word, he turned and left them there, feeling the weight of betrayal begin to lift as he walked away. He had faced his enemies, and he had won. James exited the mansion, leaving Sarah and Michael in stunned silence. But his satisfaction was far from complete. They had tried to destroy him, to rob him of his life, his dignity, his very existence. He wanted them to suffer, to feel the isolation, dread, and desperation that they had inflicted upon him. After leaving them in shock, he called Alan, who was waiting nearby, ready for the next phase of their plan. "All set, Alan?" James asked, his voice a calm counterpoint to the fury simmering beneath the surface. "Yes, sir. The authorities are ready. I've arranged for everything," Alan replied, his tone conveying loyalty and grim satisfaction. "The arrest will happen soon. But, as per your instructions, we'll allow you a few more minutes." James thanked him, steeling himself for what would come next. He had decided not to leave Sarah and Michael to the law alone. He wanted them to confront the full extent of their failures before facing justice. It was a final chance for them to see the depth of their betrayal, and to feel the consequences of underestimating him. Back inside, he found them exactly where he had left them, still seated on the couch, visibly shaken. Michael was pale, his hands trembling as he clutched the edge of the couch, while Sarah's expression had transformed from stunned disbelief to burning anger. Yet, under that anger, James detected something else: fear. "Still trying to process it all?" James asked, allowing a thin smile to tug at his lips. He enjoyed the way their composure crumbled further with each word. Sarah's eyes narrowed, her voice laced with resentment. "What do you want, James? You've already humiliated us. Isn't that enough?" "Enough?" James echoed, his tone deadly calm. He moved closer, watching as they instinctively shrank back. "You tried to kill me, Sarah. You and Michael plotted to bury me alive for money, out of nothing more than greed and impatience. And you ask me if this is enough?" Michael stammered, unable to meet James's gaze. "James, I never wanted this to happen. It was all her idea." "Really?" James's eyes fixed on Michael, cold and unyielding. "Because from what I heard, you were more than willing to go along with it. You didn't have any problems toasting my death, did you?" Michael dropped his head, his words a barely audible whisper. "I was weak, but it was never supposed to go this far," Sarah sneered, her own anger flaring. "Stop acting like a coward, Michael. You were just as involved as I was. We both wanted this." Her admission hung heavily in the air, her words both damning and irreversible. James watched them turn on each other, knowing he had set the stage for their mutual downfall. "Do you know what betrayal feels like?" James asked, his voice taking on a menacing calm. "When you're forced to realize that the person you trusted, the person you shared your life with, has been slowly and systematically dismantling everything you built together. Betrayal is being buried alive by the very people you thought were loyal to you." Sarah's face twisted, a flash of guilt appearing before she buried it beneath her anger. "Don't pretend like you were innocent in this. You were so obsessed with your work, with your success. You barely noticed I was there." James shook his head slowly, his voice filled with cold disdain. "So that's your excuse? That I was busy providing everything you wanted, that I worked long hours so you could have a life of luxury?" He let out a bitter laugh. "How hollow. You were my partner, Sarah. You were supposed to support me, not conspire to end my life." Michael broke the tense silence, his voice trembling. "Please, James, just let us go. We can start over. Leave all of this behind." James's eyes narrowed, his expression hardened by their cowardice. "Let you go? After you tried to destroy me?" He shook his head, allowing his words to fall like a sentence. "No. You both have a debt to pay. You will answer for every lie, every poisoned drink, every night I trusted you while you plotted my death." He watched the realization dawn on them as they understood there would be no escape. Michael's face turned white, and Sarah's mouth tightened into a thin line, her facade of confidence unraveling. "You'll be spending a lot of time together in a cell," James continued, savoring the fear in their eyes. "You'll have plenty of time to think about your betrayal, your lies, and the lives you destroyed, all in the name of greed." As he spoke, the sound of sirens filled the air, faint at first, but growing louder. The color drained from Sarah's face as she realized what was coming. "No, you can't," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Oh, but I can," James replied, his tone almost gentle. "You thought you'd buried me. Now it's your turn to face the consequences?" The sirens grew louder, filling the mansion with their relentless wail. Michael's head sank into his hands, muttering incoherently, while Sarah's expression turned desperate, her arrogance finally crumbling under the weight of her terror. A knock sounded on the door, and Alan entered, accompanied by 2 uniformed officers. He nodded at James, a respectful acknowledgement of his victory. "Ms. Caldwell, Mr. Lawson," Alan announced, his tone professional but icy. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder and fraud." The officers stepped forward, their presence imposing as they moved toward Sarah and Michael, whose resistance was shattered. Michael mumbled something incoherent, his spirit completely broken, while Sarah glared at James, a mix of hatred and despair in her eyes. "I hope it was worth it," James said softly as the officers led them away. "I hope every lie, every plan, every moment you betrayed me was worth the price you're about to pay." Sarah was silent, her defiance finally extinguished. As they were escorted out of the mansion, James felt an unexpected sense of peace settle over him. The weight of betrayal, though still heavy, had been tempered by justice. Alan remained by his side, watching as the officers guided Sarah and Michael into their separate police cars. "It's done," Alan said quietly, a note of finality in his voice. James nodded, his gaze fixed on the flashing lights fading into the distance. "Yes," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "It's over." As the cars disappeared, he turned back to his home. It was a place marked by betrayal, but now also by resilience. He had survived the worst his enemies could throw at him and had emerged with a new understanding of his own strength. "Thank you, Alan," he said, turning to his loyal friend. "For everything." Alan gave him a respectful nod. "Anytime, sir. You've been through hell, but you came back stronger." With a quiet sense of purpose, James Caldwell closed the door behind him, ready to rebuild his life from the ashes of betrayal. This chapter of his life had ended, but he was resolved to write a new one, this time on his own terms. The days that followed were surreal for James Caldwell. After the harrowing experience of being betrayed, buried alive, and fighting his way back, the calm that followed felt almost foreign. Sarah and Michael were in custody, facing charges that would keep them behind bars for years. The tabloids were already picking up the story, the press dubbing it the millionaire's resurrection, but James had no desire to bask in the public's fascination. This was a deeply personal matter, and the satisfaction he sought had come from confronting his betrayers face to face. Now, standing alone in his home, he walked through each room, letting himself feel the finality of his decision. This mansion, once a sanctuary of success and hard-earned wealth, felt tarnished, haunted by memories of deception and his own naivete. He had worked tirelessly to build this life, yet, in the end, he'd nearly lost it to the very people he trusted most. But he had survived. He had emerged from the grave they'd tried to bury him in, stronger and more focused. He knew he would need time to heal, time to make sense of the betrayal. But first, there were final details to address. A week later, James sat in his lawyer's office, his eyes scanning the legal documents spread out before him. He was liquidating his assets, selling off properties, and consolidating his fortune. The mansion, in particular, would be the first to go. Too many memories clung to its walls, memories he knew he would never be able to escape if he stayed. He had already chosen a quiet, secluded place in the countryside, somewhere he could finally find peace. His lawyer, a trusted family confidant named Henry, adjusted his glasses and glanced at James with a mixture of surprise and respect. "Are you sure about this, James?" Henry asked, his voice cautious. "You're walking away from everything. It's a drastic step." James met his gaze, resolute. "I am, Henry. This house, this life, it's built on everything I was. But now I'm not the same man. I can't keep living in the past, surrounded by reminders of what happened. I want a fresh start." Henry nodded, understanding. "In that case, I'll expedite the process. The paperwork should be complete within a week." James signed the final line on the documents, sealing the fate of the home he had once cherished. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to remember the life he had envisioned here, the love he thought he had shared with Sarah. But he quickly pushed the memories aside. She had taken enough from him. He wouldn't let her haunt him any longer. Days later, James stood at the gates of the mansion one last time, watching as the new owners arrived to take possession of the property. They were a young couple, hopeful and full of plans for the future, a vision of innocence and optimism that felt like a mirror of the man he used to be. With a quiet smile, he wished them well, nodding politely as he handed over the keys. When they entered, He turned his back on the mansion without a second thought. He climbed into his car, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders as he drove away from the life he was leaving behind. The countryside estate was everything he had hoped for, quiet, surrounded by nature, with a small lake reflecting the serene blue sky. He found solace in the simplicity of the landscape, in the rhythm of daily life without the pressures of his former empire. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the horizon, casting a warm, golden light over the lake, James sat by the water's edge, finally at peace. The nightmares that had plagued him after the ordeal had begun to fade. He felt stronger, more grounded, and in many ways, he was beginning to feel reborn. Alan, who had stayed with him as his closest confidant, joined him by the lake. He handed James a glass of whiskey, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had endured together. "You know, sir," Alan said, looking out over the water, "I always knew you were a fighter. I just never realized how much of one." James chuckled, shaking his head. "I didn't either, Alan. But I've learned a lot about myself these past few weeks. I realized that sometimes, surviving means letting go of everything you thought you needed." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the last of the sun's rays painted the sky in shades of amber and violet. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, James felt prepared to face it, armed with the knowledge that he had been tested by fire, and he had come through stronger on the other side. As the stars began to dot the night sky, James raised his glass, toasting not to his past or his pain, but to a future he would create on his own terms. "To new beginnings," he murmured, his voice filled with quiet conviction. Alan lifted his own glass, a soft smile on his face. "To new beginnings," and with that, James Caldwell embraced the night, leaving behind the shadows of betrayal, ready to start anew. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like. These other stories will move you too. Have a good session.